Moving right along here on the Ostrom Avenue podcast, Johnny Gadamowitz and Ethan Frank, as always. Now we have the pleasure of being joined by Zach Carey of Streaking the Lawn, covering all things UVA football related. Zach, thanks so much for coming on today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course, man. Thanks for having me on.
So we've got a big ACC Friday night battle between SU and UVA coming up. What's sort of been the synopsis of how the season has gone so far through the early going for the Cavaliers?
Yeah, so I mean, they opened up the season at home against Richmond, took a 34-17 win, I believe, and it's a comfortable margin of victory against an undermatched in conference foe. I think there was definitely some rust and some sort of like, okay, the offense isn't really clicking, and there's some things you got to clean up. But it was just that opening game win. UVA went on the road and lost to Illinois 24-3. The defense, surprisingly, was the strength in that game after being a huge weakness, just about as bad as you could get last season, while the offense only put up 3 points. There was an Illinois touchdown on a punt return there. So really the defense only let up 17 points despite being put in a lot of bad situations by the offense. And the offensive line, which is a big question mark for the Hoos, really was just not good against Illinois and against the Fighting Illini. Constant pressures on Brennan Armstrong. It's a new group, but it didn't look good. And then Armstrong and his receivers weren't clicking. There was nothing going in the run game. Just a bad game altogether. They came back home this past Saturday against Old Dominion and took a 16-14 win, which sounds a lot worse. And, you take into account Old Dominion beating Virginia Tech. UVA should have won that game 30-14, around there. There were just a lot of dumb errors. They put up 500 plus yards of offense and only scored 16 points on a last second Brendan Farrell field goal. So that game should have been a blowout, and it was if you watched it. So UVA below expectations, I think, so far. 2-1 isn't horrible, but I think looking at the scores, it's sort of it's not been what sort of a lot of UVA fans were hoping in the first 3 games of the Elliott era, especially going into sort of what was looked at as an easy first half of the schedule. Being 2-1 right now, especially with the challenges against Syracuse and potentially even Duke, not looking great for the Hoos right now, but hopefully they can, for UVA fans, they can turn things around.
You talked about those expectations, and when you look at those 2 wins against the in-state schools that they've had so far this season, what really was going on in those games that, maybe made the outcome what it was and not what people thought it should have been?
Yeah. So, I mean, as I mentioned, the offensive line was always going to be the weakness of this team, of this offense in particular. But there was an expectation that, I mean, if you just look at the raw numbers last season, Brennan Armstrong is the quarterback, set single season records for UVA in passing touchdowns, passing yards, all sorts of records were eclipsed last year. And basically the entire wide receiver room came back with Armstrong. And so it was sort of this idea of, could UVA put up a front of protection and then Armstrong and his receivers will be able to do what they do. Against ODU, there was better protection. Against Richmond, there wasn't a lot of pressure, but the QB and the wide receivers weren't producing at the same levels. There were drops among the wide receivers. Dontavion Wicks did not play well, has not played well after setting UVA's single season record for receiving yards last year. Armstrong has missed throws. He's not getting the ball to guys. He's throwing it at their feet, which is not something we saw last season. And so it's a question mark of, is it the system? Is it just regression? And I think that that's sort of where we all knew that this was going to be tough. It was going to be tough for the defense to adapt after such a bad year last year, and the offensive line to get going and get comfortable together. But no one really doubted Armstrong and the wide receivers, and that's where the problem has really been in these first couple of games, just not performing to where everybody thought that they would.
I want to hit on that Illinois game as well, because last week Syracuse played Purdue, and you looked at the Purdue track record so far. Purdue had a game against Penn State. Their other game, I believe, was against Indiana State, 56-0. Sort of felt like that to get the real nature of Purdue last week, you had to go look at that Penn State game, by far their most credible opponent so far. I'm curious, sort of similar approach, would you say, through these first 3 games for UVA, where, hey, that Illinois game going up against a Big Ten team, you want to learn as best you can about UVA football, that's the game you go look at through these first three. And of course, Syracuse fans know all too well about Tommy DeVito, former Syracuse quarterback, now getting it done with the Fighting Illini. Just how much of a good indicator would you say was that game number 2 in terms of the big picture, what this team has shown you so far through the first 3 weeks?
Yeah, so I think it's tough. I think on the one hand, there is expected, this is the first year with a new head coach. So it's expected that this team, I keep talking about expectations, but it's understood that this team will grow as the season goes on with a new head coach, because the mistakes that you make in game 1, 2, and 3 will not be the mistakes you're making in 10, 11, 12. Hopefully, ideally with a competent coaching staff. The Illinois game, I think, was exposed the coaching staff, if anything. Yeah, Armstrong had an off day, but you expect fifth-year QB experienced guy, he's going to be able to bounce back. It exposed the offensive schemes as being too slow developing. Plays trying to get, receivers going this way and that, and taking more than 3, 4, 5 seconds for plays to develop when the offensive line is barely giving Armstrong 2 seconds in the pocket before he has to bail out. And so it proved, whereas the ODU and Richmond games, like the competition, especially on the D-line, the size of guys is just not what you're going to go against even in ACC competition. So yeah, I mean, that Illinois game, I think, was, wow, the offensive coaching staff is not prepared for coaching this team and has not put them in the right position to succeed. I think defensively, honestly, the defense has been very solid. Giving up only 17 points to Illinois. They forced, I believe, 4 turnovers, 3 fumbles, and a pick. The defense has been there. There have been playmakers and guys who have come on. The rushing defense is still a problem. The defensive line can still get moved around, but by a Power 5 offensive line. But the linebackers and the secondary have played well, especially after years where the secondary was just absolute garbage. So the defense has looked better. And I think that that you see that in that Illinois game, because yes, Chase Brown put up, I think, nearly 200 yards on the ground against the Hoos, the Illinois running back, but he's done that against a lot of teams, and they were able to bend but not break. Offensively, it's about the scheming. It's about can the coaching staff scheme around this roster, around the players that they have to develop and to have more success against real competition. And that Illinois game really exposed that more than I think it exposed the roster, because I think we knew what the roster was, and it's just a matter of the guys who we know can perform at an elite level performing at an elite level.
So you talked a lot about the players, but what about Tony Elliott? I mean, Bronco Mendenhall, this was a very consistent program over the last, half decade, years or so. And now Tony Elliott comes in. What has he been like over his first 3 games? I know it's probably hard to judge after that smallest sample size, but from what you've seen covering the program so closely, what is Elliott like as a head coach?
So he has not been a head coach before. He was an offensive coordinator at Clemson, came up, in the Dabo Swinney coaching tree. And so you could tell just by little things in the first 3 games, little mistakes, that he does not know how to prepare a team for a game day in the full, complete way that he needs to. Just little things. I mean, there was one instance in that Illinois game where UVA had an interception in the end zone and tried to return it, while being 5 yards deep and running horizontally with the goal line. And then UVA followed that up with a 50-yard passing play that would have put them in scoring position had they not been on the 5-yard line. And so UVA ended up punting on that possession. So it's little things like that where there's 8 to 10 plays in that Old Dominion game where UVA could have pulled it away, could have gone up 30-14. They just struggled in the red zone. Guys are putting the ball on the ground. Blitzes aren't being picked up. And it's not a matter of guys not being able to do things. This offense we saw last year with Robert and I and Jason Beck, them put up points in different ways. One thing, Elliott likes to actually run the ball with his running backs. I know Anai's done more of that at Syracuse, but at Virginia for the last 3 or 4 years, they hadn't had a 100-yard rusher since 2018 in the Belk Bowl. And then in game 1, UVA running back puts up 100+ with a couple touchdowns, despite being a walk-on former cornerback under Bronco Mendenhall. So it's clear that Mendenhall came in with coaching experience and knew how to get his team ready for a game. Granted, Mendenhall was 2-10 in his first season, but Elliott has a much better roster that he's starting with, and this is a program. It's not like Mendenhall was fired. I mean, he built this to something. He established a standard, and now Elliott has to build on that. And I think that you're just seeing some of the inconsistencies play out, and you're seeing Elliott need to get a grip of things and needing the players sort of get used to this relatively new staff. There are a couple carryovers, but Elliott he needs to get the little things down a little bit more, and I trust that he will. I mean, you don't win a couple national championships and call plays on game-winning national championship drives if you're not detail-oriented. But we're still seeing some of just the little things go wrong that if they start clicking, the issues with this roster will be put to bed a little bit, and it won't be 16-14 against ODU or 24-3. Maybe it's closer to 24-20, and UVA can get a last minute drive, and then they blow out ODU and get everybody hyped up for ACC play. So you're hoping that switch, the switch is flipped, and you're hoping that in games 10, 11, 12, the same issues with sort of like just being prepared are no longer there as they were in games 1, 2, and 3.
I want to hit on Anae and Beck. I mean, obviously, their move over to Central New York has been very well received by Syracuse fans through the first 3 weeks. Just how much has not having those two guys there hurt Brennan Armstrong this year, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think, honestly, I think Anae, it made sense for him to leave. It was pretty obvious that he wasn't going to be the OC under a different head coach at Virginia than Bronco Mendenhall. I mean, he left the program before the bowl game. He didn't play the bowl game because of COVID, but he was in Hawaii as soon as Mendenhall said, "I'm out." So, I mean, nothing against the guy, but he did a lot of wacky things that do not sit well with UVA fans after 6 years. Throwing the ball backwards to an offensive line on a 3rd and 8 in scoring position against Virginia Tech, lost us that game. And so there's some things there that are complaints. That said, he built a fantastic scoring offense with this roster. And so I think that what you're saying with Anae is just a change in scheme and trying to be more perhaps Anae wants to it's a different system, and it's more intentional in a lot of ways with this roster, but it's less built for this roster. It's sort of that like age old trying to fit personnel into a scheme or fitting a scheme to the personnel. And right now it seems like UVA is more trying to fit the personnel to the scheme. Beck is a huge loss. Listen, I don't know a lot of quarterbacks coaches in this country in college football, but Jason Beck is a tremendous quarterbacks coach. And I think that's what you're already seeing in Syracuse's first 3 games. And I think that you're seeing Armstrong's dip a lot of ways because Beck isn't here. And I think that Beck, I mean, he built 3 NFL quarterbacks in Kurt Benkert, Bryce Perkins, and presumably Brennan Armstrong, not starters, but probably capable backups, practice squad type guys. And Beck is just, I mean, his attention to detail, the way he can get quarterbacks to perform for him is a huge loss. And I don't know why Elliott didn't try. I don't know if he did, but if UVA has Beck right now, I feel a lot better about the future of this program, frankly. And I think that Syracuse got an absolute steal with bringing him on. And I think that you're going to see over the years him to be able to develop quarterback talent tremendously well. I mean, in Benkert, Perkins, and Armstrong, we're talking 3-star guys. We're talking unheralded players who didn't have tons of success before him, and then he built into these stars at Virginia. And so I think that the loss stinks just because you don't see as much offensive creativity this year with this roster. And it's sort of a question of, gosh, what would this team have been with the old coaching staff this season if that we'd have lost a ton of guys on the offensive line to transfer. So it's a question of, what if the staff had just stayed? Like, what could this team have been? That's more short term. I think the staff can find its guys and create an offense that is successful. But Beck, in terms of talent development, is a huge loss and a huge gain for Syracuse.
So you mentioned a lot of the uncertainty within the roster, whether it be a makeshift offensive line or a dip in production from some of those guys. And then on the other side, you have your former coaches leading an undefeated team into a Friday night matchup against a team that's firing on all cylinders, that's fan base is really pumped up. So if you're Tony Elliott in Virginia, how do you prepare for something like this? Because the Dome is unlike any atmosphere you'll face in basically the rest of college football. Not to say, it'll be a full dome and the crowd will be absolutely packed, but you're still going to have, 35, maybe almost 40,000 people in there in an area where the noise is much louder than the amount of people you would think, because it is an enclosed space. So how do you think Virginia prepares for an atmosphere like that? Something they really haven't faced much since Syracuse joined the ACC.
Yeah. One thing that Elliott loves to do, and you can question the effectiveness of this or not, they did it for Illinois and see how that played out. They play the fight song continuously the week before practice. So I'm not familiar with the Syracuse fight song. I'm sure you guys potentially are, but that has been blaring on the practice field at UVA full blast for the last couple of days and will continue this week of practice. And so that's one thing that Elliott's trying to do to get his team accustomed to noise and to having to deal with a lot of I'm sure that they're putting in crowd noise. But yeah, I mean, being on the road against Illinois did not go well for this young offensive line, and when you cannot communicate as well with an inexperienced group, problems are going to arise. And so that's a big question mark. That's a big unknown about handling Syracuse. And that's why I think that the line has exploded out to whatever 11 points it is now, because you have this hot team versus a sort of middling UVA squad going to a place where it's tough to play, flying however many hours up north. And so I think that this game really does suit Syracuse in a lot of ways, even beyond home field advantage. UVA would like more time before this matchup, I'm sure, whereas Syracuse is hot. Syracuse is feeling themselves as they should be, and UVA is still trying to get the feet under them. So it's a tough game to prepare for. I definitely wouldn't want to be Tony Elliott right now, but hopefully for UVA, they can get those details handled. They can get the little things bottled up. I mean, 3 fumbles against ODU were just incredibly costly, 2 of which were in the red zone, 1 at the 4-yard line, another one at like the 45 when UVA was driving before halftime. It's things like that that can be exacerbated in an atmosphere like the Carey or the Dome. Sorry, I'm not sure what it's called now. For me, it's the Carey Dome. I'm a big lacrosse guy, so those issues can be exacerbated on the road when you can't hear, when you can't communicate as well. And so that's something UVA is going to have to deal with, and that's something that absolutely plays in the Orange's favor.
Well, we're all getting used to the JMA wireless dome transitions.
Rolls off the tongue.
But talking about the atmosphere, talking about the environment and sort of the uniqueness that it presents, who's maybe someone from a UVA standpoint that you could see being a crowd silencer, whether it's a name that we expect to hear or someone that maybe flies a little bit more under the radar, doesn't get a whole lot of praise, that you could see having a big impact?
Yeah. Keaton Thompson is probably the guy that I'd list. I talked about Wicks struggling with drops as a receiver. Keaton Thompson was a quote unquote football player under Bronco Mendenhall. That was legitimately his position group. There was a starting, this is a nine too, obviously, starting football player, backup football player. Now he's just mainly a wide receiver, but he's really a security blanket. I mean, he's 6'5", he's tough. He could practically play tight end if he bulked up some more. In his 6th year of college, he's the guy who you sort of see as, all right, if stuff is going wrong for UVA, this is who we're going to target. I mean, against ODU, he had 12 targets, 9 catches, 118 yards. That's the guy that UVA is going to look to, specifically in the passing game when things are going badly, when they can't find anything, when guys are dropping balls and Armstrong can't hit. It just find Keaton, get him the ball. He really played sort of that like Taysom Hill role for the Who's and for Robert and I last year, which I believe Syracuse has done a little bit of maybe early on. I haven't honestly seen the full 3 games, but Keaton's that guy. Defensively, transfer defensive end Cam Butler has had a couple sacks. I believe he had a strip fumble maybe in the last game or against Illinois. And he is a guy who can make a play and really go and get the quarterback for UVA a little bit. It's, he forced a lot of false start penalties on ODU. Obviously, being home makes life easier or makes life harder for opposing offensive lines. But he's a guy that's going to be active and that Syracuse is going to have to look out for on that side of the ball.
Absolutely. You mentioned the line before, and I wanted to go back to that, how it's now in double digits. And Johnny and I hit on this earlier in the pod, but I mean, Johnny and I were both at Syracuse's game against Purdue, which is a borderline miracle that they won at this point. So my question is, like, does Syracuse deserve to be a double-digit favorite in this game, or the other way, does Virginia deserve to be a double-digit underdog on the road?
Yeah, I mean, I get why the line is where it is. I think for UVA, you look at the scores and you say, okay, beat Richmond, bad Richmond team by 17, lost to a mediocre Big Ten team in Illinois by 21, and then only beat ODU by 2. The scores lied for those games. As I mentioned earlier, UVA beat ODU, or not beat ODU, but they handled ODU a lot better than the score would suggest. And I think that Syracuse sitting at 3-0, I mean, having, that 0 tally when it comes to in the loss column matters. And I think that UVA hasn't looked good in its wins. And I think that that's a problem. And I think that I understand why the line's bumped up. I would put it at 7-ish. I think Syracuse probably, I think that would be a reasonable prediction of Syracuse winning by a touchdown. But I get that at home in the Dome, everything that's going wrong for UVA right now, just in terms of getting things going in the Elliott era, makes sense. And I don't think that this necessarily deserves to be double digits, but I get why it's at that point, just because of the struggles that UVA has had and the fact that Syracuse has found ways to win games, or found a way to beat Purdue after 2 fairly dominant wins. So, touchdown game is sort of what I'm saying in Syracuse's favor rather than the double digits. But it makes sense. It fits.
All right. Well, we'll see if Tony Elliott and Brennan Armstrong can have as much success inside the Dome as Matt Moore and Connor Schellenberger have had over the past few years. That's Zach Carey. Zach, thanks so much for coming on with Streaking the Lawn of SB Nation ahead of Syracuse and Virginia Friday night.